private secretary or principal private secretary to him?
Yes, he did.
And therefore, did you work with him from July 2019 onwards?
Yes, I did.
And when did you become principal private secretary?
I believe it was in either October or November of the same year.
And did you remain Mr. Johnson's principal private secretary until mid-February 2022?
That is correct, yes.
I'd like to start your evidence, Mr. Reynolds, please, with some questions about the retention of emails and WhatsApps, given your role as the principal private secretary. Do you recall whether there was a policy in Downing Street in or around the first half of 2021 concerning whether emails should be retained, how they should be accumulated, how they should be archived, and so on?
Yes, I believe that emails relating, or non-ephemeral emails relating to decision-making processes were retained.
And for the purposes of this inquiry, were you therefore given access to emails which you sent and received in the course of your work in Downing Street, which were then put onto a laptop and allowing you to review them?
That is correct, although I think because of the nature of the IT systems, I think I only mainly saw emails which I had sent. So I don't think I saw the full comprehensive set of emails.
In his witness statement, Mr. Cummings, and you're obviously aware who Mr. Cummings is, says that in the spring of 2020, so at some point after the commencement of the pandemic, he'd asked the Cabinet Office to ensure that number 10 email accounts were saved for a future lessons learned exercise. Do you recall anything about that and whether or not there was a debate about saving emails for a lessons learned exercise?
I don't, but I believe emails were retained in the normal way under our normal policies.
Simon Case, who was Cabinet Secretary and remains Cabinet Secretary, says in his statement that in March 2021, a number 10 policy on WhatsApps was established. Do you recall anything to do with such a policy?
No, I don't.
As the principal private secretary, is that a matter with which you would have been concerned?
I would have been aware of the policy statement, I'm sure, but I cannot remember the substance. And I imagine our policy on WhatsApps, certainly throughout this period, was in a sense the same as our policy on other material, which was around retention of WhatsApps or messages which were important for the decision-making process, but not the ephemeral side of things.
Could you just go a little bit slower, please, Mr. Reynolds, whilst you give evidence? It's very hard for our stenographers to keep up with the speed of your evidence. So you say there was material relating to decision-making and WhatsApp material relating to more ephemeral matters. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think in this period, I think there is a significant shift in the volume of WhatsApps which were used for discussions reflecting the shift to remote working and the pace of some of the activities going on with people in different locations. And so certainly my experience was WhatsApp became more extensive in its usage than certainly I had experienced previously.
But that is to do with the volume. What is this distinction that you draw between WhatsApps relating to decision-making and more ephemeral WhatsApps? What are ephemeral WhatsApps?
I think that certainly from my experience of the WhatsApps that I have seen, the vast majority of those WhatsApps were of an ephemeral nature, and that decisions when they took place were taking place in the normal way and recorded in the normal way. And a lot of the WhatsApps you are seeing, it seems to me, are exchanges which people could have been doing previously by telephone or in corridors or things like that. They are now just recorded in WhatsApp, but are ephemeral in nature, in the same way as if there's a conversation about a policy matter before people go into a substantive discussion in the corridor where someone might say something to me or to others. We're not necessarily recording all of that because it's ephemeral in nature. Where the decision takes place and the process leading to that decision are recorded in a normal way.
You're not suggesting, are you, that the vast majority of these COVID-related WhatsApps are irrelevant?
No, I think they're relevant to the COVID inquiry, but in terms of the decision-making process and the obligation on civil servants to record formally steps in the decision-making process, it's a bit different.
So I'm not following. Why aren't they part of the decision-making process?
Because I suppose in any decision, there is all sorts of ephemeral discussions around a policy. Not all of those discussions are recorded in full, even in the main meetings themselves.
But, Mr. Reynolds, they are all relevant, are they not, to the state of mind of the sender and indirectly the recipient? Mm-hmm. They are all relevant to the debate about COVID and the decisions which were then being taken, are they not?
That is correct, and that is why I retained all of my WhatsApps, and I handed over my WhatsApps to the inquiry in full.
And that presumably was because you were aware from a very early stage that your WhatsApps would be relevant to any inquiry that might thereafter take place, as well as to perhaps lessons learned exercises, as well as providing a contemporaneous understanding of the thinking of the persons who sent and received WhatsApps.
Correct.
Yes. You were aware, were you not, that the WhatsApps from the core decision makers and advisors would all become relevant in due course?
Yes.
Could we have 265619, page 68, please? This is a WhatsApp message between yourself and Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, in December 2021, so later this year, where after a debate about the general mood and the way in which matters are progressing, particularly on the Omicron front, because this is December 2021, towards the bottom of the page, Simon Case, PM is mad if he doesn't think his WhatsApps will become public via COVID inquiry, but he was clearly not in the mood for that discussion tonight. We'll have that battle in the new year. Martin Reynolds, that is, of course, you, agree. Thanks for your help. What was the battle about, Mr. Reynolds?
I cannot recall, but I imagine that the Prime Minister, I'm afraid I can only speculate, but I imagine he hadn't realised that all of his WhatsApps would become public via the COVID inquiry.
Because, of course, as the then Prime Minister, his WhatsApps would form a vital part of a full, transparent examination of the decision-making at the time.
Yes.
As yours would.
Yes.
Yes. When was it first understood in number 10 Downing Street that there might be a public inquiry?
I'm afraid I cannot recall. But I think in certainly the early stages, I and others were not thinking in those terms. I mean, certainly in the very sort of pressured period of early 2020, I don't think I was really reflecting on whether there would be a public inquiry. I was much more focused on dealing with the day-to-day challenges at that time. So I would have thought it would be after that, but how far after that I cannot comment.
You will know from the disclosure, Mr. Reynolds, that Sir Patrick Vallance's evening notes, his diaries, as well as some other notebooks and emails disclosed in the inquiry, show that the notion of there being a public inquiry first appeared in the general discourse around about the end of 2020, in the beginning of 2021. Does that sound right to you?
That sounds entirely plausible.
We've already seen an entry in the notes of Sir Patrick Vallance in which he records the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, as saying that any inquiry should go on for a decade or more, wants someone like Savile to chair it and keep it going forever, and that's dated the 3rd of November 2020. Did you take part in any debate about the nature or the extent or the time of an inquiry?
I was involved in the discussions which the Prime Minister had about the nature of an inquiry, but I don't think, comment on that particular exchange.
The then Prime Minister made an announcement to Parliament on the 12th of May 2021. Could we have that, please, on the screen? 273904. And then to the second page, please. Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will update the House in our response to COVID. And then if you could scroll through, please, to the next page. The state has an obligation to examine its actions as rigorously and candidly as possible and to learn every lesson for the future, which is why I've always said that when the time is right, there should be a full and independent inquiry. And he announces, does he not, therefore the institution of that inquiry. And then further down the page, a reference to consulting with the devolved administrations. And then over one more page, please. He refers to the exercise of identifying and disclosing all relevant information, the burden that that will place on the participants. And then further down the page and over the page. He says this in the bottom 6 entries. This inquiry must be able to look at the events of the last year in the cold light of day and identify the key issues that will make a difference for the future, free to scrutinise every document. As the Principal Private Secretary, presumably you had a hand in advising the Prime Minister and assisting in the process by which the Prime Minister decided that there would be a public inquiry and that it would be announced to Parliament. Do you recall that process, Mr. Reynolds?
I think the process was actually on the basis of advice from the Cabinet Office and discussions with the Cabinet Office team. So I was present for that discussion, or may well have been present for elements of that discussion, but I was not responsible for the advice and the process through which it came to that conclusion.
You knew, did you not, that the Prime Minister was considering instituting a public inquiry and that that would be announced to Parliament? Mm-hmm. If yes, please
yes,
say so.
Yes.
And presumably that process by which the announcement was drafted and by which the decision was made to have a public inquiry took a matter of weeks. Presumably these decisions aren't just made on the spot.
No, it was probably longer than weeks.
So at least before April of that year, mm-hmm. If this was May 2021, at least a month.
Yeah.
You were party to a WhatsApp group called PM Updates, were you not?
Yes.
Could we have 265631? PM Updates from Martin Reynolds' phone. It's a group that was formed on the 16th of November 2020, was it not?
Yes.
You created group PM Updates. Is you, Martin Reynolds?
It is indeed, yes.
At 2017 on that day, you said, I've created a new group to focus on updates, diary, etc. from the outer office. And I think in that group were the Prime Minister, yourself, Cleo Watson, Stuart Glassborough, Henry Cook and Dan Rosenfield, all the Prime Minister's closest advisors. Mm-hmm. This was no doubt a hugely important WhatsApp group.
if I can explain the PM update system, that might sort of give you a better sense of actually its importance, which is that we had throughout most of this time a system of updating, of giving the Prime Minister updates on factual developments, on quick decisions he might need to be taking, and that was done initially in paper copy. The PM Updates group essentially translated that paper copy into WhatsApp, but it remained, unlike almost any other WhatsApp group, basically on email and hard copy. So what you had was, as it were, parallel structures, where what I would do is I was sent an email with the updates for the day on. I would put it onto a WhatsApp and send it to the Prime Minister, and then I would take it back from the Prime Minister and send an email out with his record on it. And so, unlike the other WhatsApp groups we will no doubt want to talk about, it was actually a mechanistic way of delivering to the Prime Minister unclassified material which he could look at, as it were, at an appropriate time each evening, and it was done on a daily basis. But actually, the chain of record keeping was all done through email or hard copy and back out again. So essentially what you're seeing here is the central bit in the process where something goes to the Prime Minister by WhatsApp and is sent back again. And so what I was doing there was, as it were, acting as a way of transmitting that to the Prime Minister. But in terms of the substance of the decisions, some were fairly low level, and some were quite mechanistic, as could be questions about who he wanted to see or things like that.
You're not suggesting that this WhatsApp group was anything other than highly relevant to the information that the Prime Minister was receiving. It deals with matters such as parliamentary business and the dealing with the COVID pandemic, how the DHSC would respond, cabinet affairs, we can see from this page, shielding, clinically extremely vulnerable MPs. This was hugely important information. You were telling the Prime Minister daily, hourly, by minute, information he needed to know.
Correct.
And you're not suggesting that it replicated exactly other written material, written emails or notes. You wouldn't surely have just been replicating word for word everything that was being sent by email.
I think I was certainly taking the responses from the Prime Minister, which were typically very short, and relaying them back into email, back out to a wider circulation list.
There is information in this WhatsApp group, which runs to 115 pages, that is not elsewhere to be found in notes in his red box, notes to the Prime Minister, or emails, is there?
I'm surprised by that. I think if we checked the number 10 record, you would find that there are emails coming in and out. Since as I say, the content of the WhatsApps was all delivered to me by email, and I transferred it into a WhatsApp and sent it to the Prime Minister and then back again.
The general topics were, of course, the subject of debate in email, face-to-face conversations, as well as multiple WhatsApp groups. But the detail was not being replicated elsewhere. You weren't cut and pasting other documents into this WhatsApp group, were you?
I was, yes.
In entirety?
Yes. And I was then responding by email, and that's why it's different from the other WhatsApp groups I'm in. So you can see, at least, yes, I mean, I'm not typing these texts into the WhatsApp itself. I'm literally receiving it onto my phone, cutting and pasting it, sending it to the Prime Minister, and then taking his response and sending it out again.
Why would you need to cut and paste everything from an email into a separate WhatsApp group?
Well, I mean, in a sense, it's something actually I introduced with Philip Hammond. Right? It's a way of distilling paperwork to a minister, reducing and boiling it down in a way which means it is readily comprehensible. So rather than lots and lots of separate box returns or billet doux or whatever, what you do is you distill it into one document, normally of 2 or 3 sides, and then the minister can read through quite quickly every day a whole bunch of updates and other things, so it can be updated in an efficient way. This is, as it were, an evolution of that, which I think reflected the Prime Minister's desire to receive it on WhatsApp rather than in hard copy, so he could get that information and respond at whatever time was convenient for him, overnight or early in the morning or whenever it might be. So it's a bit different from a normal WhatsApp where I might be typing in a message.
Well, let's have a look at page 16 and 17, pages 16 and 17, which are good indications of the sort of information that you were providing. In the middle of the page, generate speaking to Starmer, Ray Liverpool, Ben Ed, and I all think a good idea, but just to be advised, is it?
Yeah, to be aware.
To be aware. Netanyahu, the Premier of Israel, has asked for an urgent call re vaccines. We've declined. You then talk about the commercial evictions moratorium, and over the page 17. Vaccine deployment, parliamentary affairs, information about the ECB. Are you saying all this was cut and pasted from other emails which you
I would need to check but I did not type all of those in as WhatsApps, no. Now, right. Some of those emails, some of those messages, you are right, may have been things I'd added in. Right. But if you look at the majority of that you're looking at, that is all stuff which has been cut and pasted. So, for example, on the screen, the Cabinet Secretary has signed off the following agenda. That is literally cut and pasted from a document I've been sent. Similarly, the ECB announcement, that's literally cut and pasted. So essentially, it's a transmission mechanism. It's different from most other WhatsApps. That isn't to say that some of the responses on there might have been typed in manually, but looking at this list, the vast majority, if not all, have been cut and pasted. And there'll be documents in number 10 which will literally have daily update 10th of December with all of these things in, and there'll be an email to me with it, an email out with it, where I explain the Prime Minister has noted all these issues.
But not all of it, you would agree, Mr. Reynolds. Some of the information appears only in these WhatsApp threads, correct?
I think some, possibly, but I'd need to check it off. And I think the other thing I would say is it comes back to my point about ephemeral and non-ephemeral. What's actually been recorded here is the flow of update material into the Prime Minister, which is read out again by email.
Mr. Reynolds, all this material is directly relevant, is it not, to the management of the COVID pandemic? Whether it's to do with his business in Parliament, or in government, or in Number 10, or Downing Street, or how the government generally is responding. It's all to do with COVID, isn't it? The material that we have not redacted on the basis it's irrelevant and sensitive. Correct?
Yes.
Right. Could we have page 114, please? On the 15th of April of 2021, so just a matter of a few weeks before Mr. Johnson announced the public inquiry to Parliament, you turned on the disappearing message function in this WhatsApp group. New messages will disappear from this chat 7 days after they're sent. And if we look at the bottom of the page, August 2021, and then over the page to 115, it's obvious from the people who joined and left that the WhatsApp group continued.
Yes.
Until you left on the 20th of March 2022. So you were plainly discussing COVID-related matters between the moment you turned the disappearing function on to March 2022 when you left. Correct?
Yes.
Why did you turn on the disappearing message function around the time that the Prime Minister announced a public inquiry into the COVID pandemic?
I cannot. I can guess or I can speculate, but I cannot recall exactly why I did so. But as I say, my explanation is this WhatsApp group was very different from any other WhatsApp group on my phone, in that it was essentially funneling information into the Prime Minister and out, and all of that was recorded separately in hard copy or in email form, including the Prime Minister's comments. So that flow of information of updating him on developments was recorded properly on our systems. Now, I can speculate as to why I might have done it. As I said at the start, I've kept all my other WhatsApps for the relevant period and handed them over. So I don't believe it was intended to prevent the inquiry from having sight of this. It could, for example, have been because I was worried of someone screenshotting or using some of the exchanges and leaking them.
Well, these are your closest colleagues, and you had obviously been engaging with them in this WhatsApp group for many, many months. In fact, from 16th of November 2020 until April 21, correct?
Yes.
There was no change in the number 10 system whereby emails were being sent to the Prime Minister and notes were being put into his red box, were there, around April?
No.
So it wasn't that the system had changed, requiring you to no longer engage in this WhatsApp communication. You just turned on the disappearing function.
Correct. But I didn't. I mean, again, I mean, I think I see what you're pushing at, but I didn't put disappearing function on any of my other WhatsApps, and the rationale for doing this is unclear to me, and I cannot remember that far out. But as I say, the PM Updates WhatsApp group was based on a formal sort of flow of paperwork, and so arguably all of that material is still available to the inquiry.
This WhatsApp group is not available because the disappearing function was turned on by you in April 2021.
Correct.
Right. Could we now then look, please, for a moment at the structure and the structure number 10 and your role as the Principal Private Secretary? You were, in essence, the Director General of Downing Street, were you not? You were essentially the head of the private office and responsible for the management of number 10 as a corporate entity.
Correct. Would it be helpful if I just explained the different elements in number 10 and tried to show how number 10 worked in its sort of slightly strange hybrid political and civil service way?
Would you mind terribly, Mr. Reynolds, if I just ask the questions, and if you feel that there is evidence that you wish to give about the role of 10 Downing Street, then you can answer appropriately. In Downing Street, there were obviously a number of very important but different moving parts. There's yourself as the Principal Private Secretary. There is the civil service element. There are other private secretaries. Mm-hmm. There is the Cabinet Secretary, who, of course, is, as it says on the tin, the Secretary to the Cabinet, a member of the civil service, but also advisors to the Prime Minister, who were not themselves civil servants. Is that correct?
Correct.
And, for example, they included Mr. Dominic Cummings.
Correct.
To what extent, Mr. Reynolds, were you, as the head of the private office, as the principal private secretary, responsible for keeping the Prime Minister informed as to what was going on? Was it a function that you exclusively held, or was it a function held alongside other civil servants, or was it a divided function, that is to say, between the civil service and Mr. Cummings and his group of advisors?
The role of the private office, which is a team of about 20 people, it essentially manages the Prime Minister's day-to-day professional existence. So its role is to manage the flow of papers between the government machine and the Prime Minister, to organise the meetings which people are requesting and trying to put those in the diary at the right time, right period of time, and all of those sorts of issues. So it's a running the professional existence of the the Prime Minister and linking back into the government machine, both in the Cabinet Office, where the Cabinet Secretary is the lead official, and out into departments. So it is acting, as it were, as connective tissue between the government machine and the Prime Minister.
Was there anybody higher than you in terms of civil service appointment? Did you answer to anybody, for example, the Cabinet Secretary, or are you the senior official in Downing Street?
I am the senior DG in Downing Street, but the Cabinet Secretary is my line manager. And he, in fact, both Mark Sebwell and Simon Case are in Downing Street the whole time. And so there is it's a slightly fluid sort of interplay between the Cabinet Secretary and Downing Street.
I think you attended all the important meetings in relation to those areas of policy for which you were primarily responsible. Is that because there were areas of policy that you particularly focused on, as opposed to your other private secretaries, the other private secretaries in Downing Street?
I mean, I didn't really have a core policy responsibility. So, and different private secretaries manage their relationship differently. So some principal private secretaries would have a policy responsibility, but I only dealt with, I suppose, as a core policy responsibility, some of the most sensitive intelligence issues which didn't go to other people. And you have a team of private secretaries who are covering each of the policy areas. And so for the purposes of COVID, you have Imran Shafi, who I think you are seeing after me, and his role was covering the public services, so he would cover all the policy issues in his area and would be the person who would be, as it were, managing the flow of papers in that area, managing updates, keeping the Prime Minister abreast of things. I had a slightly broader remit where I was essentially leading the private office as a collective entity, managing the relationship with the Cabinet Office. I also did a number of sort of slightly more bespoke things like managing the relationship with the palace, and I also oversaw the overall administration of the building, which in the COVID period becomes much more significant.
Of course.
So I have a wider set of responsibilities. I look across the full set of policy issues, but the individual private secretaries, who are each extremely talented and tend to have a background in the issues they're working on, were the people who were leading the issue within Downing Street and basically acting as that connective tissue, even if I was then in some of the meetings.
The material shows, Mr. Reynolds, that you debated COVID at great length in the WhatsApp groups to which you were a member, that you attended a huge number of meetings with the Prime Minister in relation to COVID. You were privy to the debates before Cobra, the debate in Cabinet about COVID. You essentially tracked what was going on, did you not?
In reality, I think Stuart Glassborough and Imran Shafi were much more into the detail of exactly what was happening on COVID. And I was indeed present for many of the discussions. But that was to get a broad overview of what is going on. The decision-making processes, the detail of what is happening was being tracked in much more detail by Stuart and Imran.
You must have debated the vital decisions that were being taken in the course of the COVID pandemic with the Prime Minister and his closest advisors. You were his principal private secretary, were you not?
The closest decisions, I mean, it seems to me on COVID, you had world experts who were advising on how to handle issues. My job was to try and make sure that the private office machine was underpinning, or making sure that the decisions which needed to go to the Prime Minister, the meetings, and all the sort of arrangements around the processes were there to enable the Prime Minister to get the best possible advice from the real experts on COVID and to hear from his ministers or other political advisors some of the political dynamics around those decisions. I was not, if that is what you are suggesting, there to give the Prime Minister advice on COVID, and would have felt very uncomfortable to be someone who was, as it were, taking a position against the expert advice of Chris Whitty or Patrick Vallance, or indeed the Cabinet Secretary or some of the other figures there. So it's a very, you have a lot of key players who are providing advice to the Prime Minister. The role of the private office very often is around choreography and making sure the right people are there at the right time, managing the processes around the Prime Minister, so preparing for press conferences, preparing for parliamentary statements. So it's the organisational underpinning for what is going on, but the actual advice to the Prime Minister came from others.
You sent notes to the Prime Minister, which were put into his red box, concerning developments in relation to the COVID pandemic, did you not?
Correct.
Did you send emails to the Prime Minister and others expressing your views as to what should be done about the many complex features of the COVID pandemic?
I don't recall. I don't recall giving advice on the substance of COVID. Now, the role of the private secretary is to enable the flow of information from the department or from the Cabinet Office or from other parts of the government system to the Prime Minister and out again, to make sure that that moves quickly and that to some extent there is an efficient process for managing that. In terms of expressing my views on COVID, I don't believe I did on a regular basis, and I certainly wouldn't have done so formally. I think what we're doing, I imagine we'll want to come back to the different phases in the pandemic, but a lot of what I was doing, certainly in the sort of crisis phase, is making sure that the private secretaries are structured and able to pick up the various strands of activity coming out of meetings, to drive that through the system and to bring it back to the Prime Minister and to others for meetings.
Imran Shafi, who was a private secretary, and you were his line manager because you're the principal private secretary, he, of course, gave advice to the Prime Minister regularly, repeatedly in relation to aspects of COVID.
He's regularly giving exactly steers, but I was not leading on COVID. I was not. I was making sure that the overall machine and the processes were working, and I was not in the detail, and so not able to give advice in the same way as Imran, or indeed Stuart
Glassborough.
Stuart Glassborough, yes.
You're aware that Mr. Cummings, in his statement to this inquiry, suggests that you are too deferential to the Prime Minister and shied away from confronting him with hard issues. What do you say to that?
I think, well, I imagine as part of our evidence, we'll come back to the departure arrangements for Mark Sedwill. I think on a number of occasions where I felt it was necessary and I needed to step in, I gave the Prime Minister very clear advice when I disagreed with him. But those were on issues where I felt it was my role as the principal private secretary to step in and give that advice. And I can identify 3 or 4 such examples if that would be helpful.
Your position is that those all related, however, to the organisational aspects of Number 10, to the role by which advice was given by others, how the system worked to support the Prime Minister, in essence.
Correct.
Tell us then, please, whether there is any basis to the suggestion also made by Mr. Cummings that in February and March of 2020, there was an untoward degree of optimism bias on the part of the Prime Minister, a sense of, well, the worst is not going to happen. We may be overreacting here. It could be swine flu. There's nothing to see here, or not too much to see here. Is there any basis for that suggestion?
Well, I think if you look at the paperwork through from January, February, March, well, actually till late February, while there are clearly reports coming in identifying some of the risks and challenges around COVID, the tone of those communications, which I imagine we may want to come back to, was very much that the system was tracking this very carefully, the right processes were in place to manage that, and that whilst there were potentially large challenges ahead, that in a sense the plans and the preparations were broadly in place. And I think there was a sort of reassuring message coming up into Number 10 during that period. Now, in terms of the Prime Minister's perspective, I think he is instinctively optimistic, but I also think that he instinctively believes that as a leader, it's important to project confidence and ability to deal with things. But I think that the suggestion you're making is one which is shared not just, as it were, by the Prime Minister, but across the centre of government more generally. That in a sense, this is a worrying pandemic in China. It was being tracked quite closely, and the preparations were in place to deal with it if necessary.
The secret's in the word bias. The suggestion is that there was a degree of optimism bias. That is to say that the sunny outlook adopted by the Prime Minister and perhaps by others in government was not justified by the developing reality, by the objective state of facts.
I think your inquiry will be better able to verify that than I can.
You are Mr. Johnson's principal private secretary. You must have formed a view in February and March as to whether or not the government was getting on top of the problem with sufficient alacrity, sufficient speed, and attention to detail. I
think, well, from the paperwork certainly I have here, at the end of February there is a note to the Prime Minister setting out, as it were, the assessment of the challenges that COVID presented, and that note is produced by a group of the most senior advisors on the issue, plus the director of the Civil Contingency Secretariat, and that note I can see does seem to be pretty. I wouldn't say reassuring, but gives the sense that the system is gripping the challenge in an appropriate way. And I recognise that after that, within about 2 or 3 weeks period, the government is looking at very fundamental interventions. But I would just observe that many of those interventions were not highlighted or identified in the note at the end of February. So, I mean, I agree that, with the benefit of hindsight, it does appear that we should have been far more vigorously looking and testing our arrangements for what was coming, and that would arguably have made a big difference when the crisis hit.
You're referring to a note to the Prime Minister on the 28th of February, and we'll come back to that in due course. Mm-hmm. What about before the end of February, though, Mr. Reynolds? And putting aside hindsight, it was apparent, wasn't it, by the middle of February, that there was sustained human-to-human transmission in the community in the United Kingdom, correct?
Correct.
It was obvious because SAGE and through the CMO and the CSA, the government, SAGE had advised, and through the CMO and the CSA, the government was aware that the ability of the state to be able to control the spread of the virus was very much weakened. It was plain that there would be very real difficulties in controlling the spread of the virus, correct?
I defer to your judgment.
Well,
I haven't got the record in front of me. But
do you recall?
I recall the flow of information highlighting the growing problem of COVID in terms of, actually the assessment of what that means and what the reality means in terms of the UK government response. That, in a sense, is not the responsibility of the PPS. That was, you would expect advice to be coming in saying, as we found out 2 or 3 weeks later, that we're not prepared to deal with X, Y, or Z, and we need to address it very quickly.
Mr. Reynolds, you sat in on those meetings with the Prime Minister in early, middle, and late February, did you not?
Yes.
You sent emails about COVID and received emails about COVID in the early part and the middle part and late part of February, did you not?
Correct.
So you must have formed a view as to what the level of the crisis was and whether or not, in fact, the absence of means to control the virus, the fact that it had already started to spread in the United Kingdom, presented the government with an alarming conundrum, with a with a terrible prospect, correct?
Correct.
So why was it, to use your words, only at the end of February that the government machine, to paraphrase your evidence, proceeded to deal with this crisis, to deal with the problem, which was already then apparent?
Well, as I say, I mean, I think the evidence from what you're saying seems to suggest that we should have been assessing the situation differently and moving more quickly. But that certainly, from the as I say, from the note at the end of February, the overall sense was the relevant parts of government were already, as it were, looking over exactly what needed to be done in preparations. And the overall message was that while there are some difficult decisions, or there will be some difficult decisions to be taken, the government machine is prepared for that eventuality.
You have a great deal of experience, of course, in the civil service with the management of government. It's what you do. To what extent was Mr. Johnson's administration in January and February of 2020 an inexperienced one, or a new one, or one that might, because of the novelty, and of course the general election had only taken place a few months before, that perhaps it was unable structurally to be able to cope with a crisis of this magnitude?
Well, I think it is fair to say that the dynamics in January, February, March of 2020 were very different to the dynamics before the election. Obviously, the majority was very different, but there had been a very big shift in overall focus pre-election on Brexit and the Brexit negotiations, and that had been pretty, well, it had been the overriding focus of that entire period for 3 or 4 months, and that had been concluded. The election had happened, and it did feel like there was a significant, as it were, turning of the page, because with a majority of 80 or whatever it was, there was a sense that the government had a 5 or 10 year time horizon to look at, and there was a really strong focus on the forward agenda. So at the beginning of January, there was an away day in Chequers, which I attended. There was some work around what I would view as being sort of completing Brexit, not masses, but it was around closing down the Department for exiting the European Union. There were some very big decisions around HS2, big decisions around 5G and the rollout of 5G technology across the UK. And so there was, as it were, a very different feel to Downing Street, a very different feel to the centre of government, as we were trying to get used to what this new political reality meant. And I think, if I may continue, please. The other thing I would say within Downing Street specifically was we were getting used to a slightly divergent internal politics, because it was increasingly clear that the Prime Minister's and Dominic Cummings's agendas were not overlapping, or were overlapped in part, but were quite different. And that, in that period, meant that we were starting to try and work out what are the priorities, how do we deliver this, and what are we, what are we trying to achieve as a collective? And that dynamic, I think, was starting to become more prominent. The other dynamic, I would say, during this period is a sort of unease with some of the messaging and actions taking place. So it was during this period that we were talking about the appointment of various, and I use quotes here, weirdos and misfits, and bringing in very different people into Downing Street. And we had the case of Mr. Sabisky, who you remember is a advisor brought in who had unusual views on eugenics, and after 3 days he resigned. There was a lot of work going on around a possible reorganisation of Number 10 because we were considering relocating the Prime Minister's office to a different part of the building. So a lot of work was going on that. And there was, I think, quite a bit of unease in the civil service around, and I excuse my language, the so-called shit list of people who were thought to be at risk in what was perceived to be a potentially more muscular approach to the civil service. So I think it is fair to say, in the period you're talking about, there were quite a lot of other things taking place, which meant that quite a bit of senior energy and attention was focusing on other things.
I'm just going to pause you there, please, Mr. Reynolds. It's a very long answer. The dynamic between Mr. Cummings and the Prime Minister, of course, changed during the course of the year, did it not? And in the end, Mr. Cummings left at the end of 2020. But that dynamic, was that a major feature of any instability in Downing Street in that early period, January, February, which is what I'm concerned about?
I think the dynamic, there is an unusual dynamic around Dominic Cummings in that, in many ways, in my view, he was the most empowered Chief of Staff Downing Street has seen, and was the person whose writ ruled and was able to drive things through the machine in a way I suspect few other Chiefs of Staff have done. But what I would also say is that the Prime Minister at the time did not work exclusively on the basis of advice of his Chief of Staff, and that if you look at many of the policy debates going on, he was looking to other advisors within Number 10 to express their views, and he liked, as it were, a multiplicity of different arguments and advice from which he could choose. And I think a particularly important political advisor in this context was Ed Lister, who would often give a very different assessment or perspective on many of the core issues, reflecting his role or his previous roles in local government and in business. And so whilst you're right, there is a sort of very clear political direction, there are the two bits of confusion I would add to that. One is that Dominic Cummings isn't, like most previous Chiefs of Staff, always pursuing the same agenda as the Prime Minister, and that the Prime Minister himself is looking to hear divergent views. And HS2 is a good example of that.
Mr. Reynolds, I'm going to pull you back from a debate about HS2. My question asked you what the position was in Downing Street in January and February. The dynamic between Mr. Cummings and the Prime Minister did not begin to deteriorate until later in the year. The reorganisation, in particular, the introduction of a new Director General, a Permanent Secretary in Number 10, and the setting up of COVID-S and COVID-O, and Lord Sedwell's departure was all later in the year, predominantly from May onwards. And the other matters of which you've spoken, with the exception of Mr. Cummings' appeal for weirdos and misfits, were all later in the year. I want to ask you, what was the state of play, the ability of Number 10 to function efficiently in February, when these momentous decisions were started to be taken?
I think is what I'm saying is we were in a process of bedding into a new reality, and whilst you're right that the relationship between Dominic Cummings and the Prime Minister was very good at this stage, but I do think it's relevant as to how he operates even when the relationship is very good, and as it were, the approach which relies on multiple sources of debate and information, and the fact that you have a misalignment between the Prime Minister and the Chief of Staff in terms of what they're trying to achieve.
But it wasn't just Mr. Cummings, was it? Mr. Reynolds? I mean, it's not. Are you suggesting that any lack of efficiency or efficacy in Downing Street was solely the responsibility of Mr. Cummings? And
not at all, no, and I wouldn't wish to be suggesting that at all. But what I'm trying to suggest is that in this period, we're getting used to a different type of working arrangement to what we were experiencing, as it were, before the general election. And I'm not saying that, I'm not looking to, as it were, to blame, or I'm just trying to give a sense of a bedding down of a new operation where people are trying to work out how this new reality works, what the priorities are, how we manage the different personalities, and all of those sorts of things. And I think it does have an impact into the mood and the nature of Number 10 at this early period.
You are aware, of course, that Sir Patrick Vallance, who played an extraordinarily important part in the response to the pandemic and was the liaison, of course, along with Professor Sir Chris Whitty, between SAGE and the government, has described the position in Number 10. On one occasion, on the 5th of April, he says, Number 10, chaos as usual. In June, his notes refer to the fact that no one in Number 10 or the Cabinet Office had really read or taken time to understand science advice. He says it's quite extraordinary. And he remarks, albeit later in the year, that Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, had reported to him that Number 10 was at war with itself. Would you agree that there was an unusual degree of chaos, dysfunctionality, lack of efficiency in Number 10 during those early important months?
I think that in the early months, there is a bedding down of a new working arrangement. So if we're talking about January, February, and probably the early bit of March, we are, in my view, bedding down new arrangements. But the flow of information into Number 10, which you will no doubt hear from Imran Shafi and others, the actual work process and so forth, are, I think, managing in the normal way.
All right.
What I would like, if I may, at some point, milady, is just to talk you through what happens when we go into crisis, because I noticed that the comment you ascribed to Patrick Vallance was in early April, and I think it's important, as I'm sure you do, but it might be helpful to you if I explain what happens when an organisation like Downing Street, or at least when the government goes into crisis, and how that impacts on our operations.
Well, we if I may venture to speak for my lady, we will be getting there.
Fine, okay.
The Cabinet Office, it is plain, formed an absolutely crucial part of the government's response, because the crisis machinery, geographically, institutionally, is within the Cabinet Office, and plainly there has to be the closest working relationships between the Cabinet Office and Number 10 in order to respond properly to a crisis. Would you agree?
Correct.
There is evidence, both from Mr. Alex Thomas, who gave evidence to this inquiry, and from Mr. Cummings' statement, and we'll, of course, we'll be hearing from him tomorrow, that the Cabinet Office had huge numbers of unnecessary staff. It was bloated, he says, particularly at senior level, with poor responsibility. There was a lack of clarity around the decision-making processes. It couldn't drive priorities or fix problems with departments. That, in essence, it failed to be able to drive the crisis machinery forward, again in those crucial early months. Would you agree?
In a sense, Mr. Keith, that's the same point I would make about the shift from, it seems to me you've got a period, probably January, February, where it's normal activity, as it were. You have a crisis machinery, a tracking a crisis in China, and they are feeding that information into number 10, and that is, as it were, the process underway at that stage. And as you've highlighted, you can argue, and I think I would agree, that we were not sufficiently quick at identifying the scale of the problem and of road testing the plans and preparations we had in place. But I think that is a different question to what then happens when we shift into crisis. And I think some of the criticisms you're alleging of the Cabinet Office relate really to that period when we go into crisis.
But they are systemic issues, are they not? And whether or not it's appropriate to divide up a chronology or a reaction or a response by way of evidence gathering stage, response stage, do something stage. What is suggested by Mr. Cummings and others is that the system in the Cabinet Office was not working well. Its staffing levels and organisation were inefficient. It was unable systemically to be able to drive priorities or solve problems between other government departments. It was incapable functionally of responding well to a crisis. That is the suggestion. Do you agree?
I think there are organisational challenges within the Cabinet Office, and I do think that there are many things which could have been done differently. But I think, again, the real challenge for the Cabinet Office at this stage, in my view, is that it didn't have the plans and processes in place to move from the early stage through to the crisis stage and manage it in the way a normal crisis would be managed. And of course, the flip side of that is the scale of COVID is so big that if you have a very big pandemic, once in a generation crisis, and you don't have the right plans in place, then of course the machinery starts to find it very, very difficult to function. But I think your underlying question is, are there, on top of that, additional inefficiencies in the Cabinet Office? And the answer is yes.
Mr. Reynolds, I'd invite you to speak plainly, if I may be so bold. If the plans and processes were not there within the department that is responsible for crisis machinery, if it's not good enough, the way in which it responded, if there were many challenges organisationally, then the Cabinet Office essentially failed to do what it was required to do in the face of the pandemic.
I think it goes, in terms of the plans and procedures, it's why, in a sense, I think it is worth looking at the whole crisis response. It seems to me the plans and procedures were not in place at the departmental level. It seems to me you have to look at every single level of crisis planning. In a normal crisis, the department is the department which leads the crisis, and the plans were manifestly not sufficiently developed at the departmental level. That then leads into the Cabinet Office level, where I agree with you that there are not the sufficient plans and processes in place. And so at every level, I agree with you, there are challenges.
The other government departments failed perhaps in other different ways, but the Cabinet Office, whose prime responsibility is to broker between departments, to pursue the whole government approach, to operate the crisis machinery, failed to get on top of this problem, did it not?
Correct.
Right. And the problems with the Cabinet Office continued, did they not, after February, March? Because, as you know again very well, WhatsApps between Mr. Cummings and Mr. Johnson, and emails, in fact, between you and Helen McNamara and Tom Shinner and others, make absolutely plain that the Cabinet Office, quote, doesn't work for anyone. It's high friction, low trust, low performance. That there was institutional friction between Number 10 and the Cabinet Office, and to use Mr. Johnson's words, the Cabinet Secretary was miles off pace. Those were all problems that continued after February, March, did they not?
I would almost, with the greatest of respect, I would almost flip that. That the problems become very manifest in March, April, because essentially a government machine which is configured for certain types of crisis is confronting a crisis of a magnitude larger, and the processes at the departmental level, at the and at the Cabinet Office level are inadequate to deal with them. So the challenges in the crisis response become much more evident at that stage.
So the failures, if that is what Milady concludes they were manifest across the board, because there was a failure of the government departments to produce plans and to get on top of the problems for which they were responsible, and a failure by the Cabinet Office to manage the crisis at the core of government.
Yes, I mean, that is why I do wonder whether it might be helpful to set out how I think a crisis works, and how the different strands fit together.
Forgive me, I'm going to show you your own emails just in a moment, Mr. Reynolds. You'll have to restrain yourself until we see them. The very experienced civil servant Helen McNamara, who of course you know, has said in her statement that there were collective concerns that wrong people were in the room, and so the Prime Minister was not being given sufficiently expert policy advice. Would you agree?
Yes, at times.
Were there concerns between Number 10 and the Cabinet Office regarding the clarity about who was leading in which areas?
Yes.
Was it clear that structures across government were struggling to cope with the demands that they faced, both inside the Cabinet Office and across the centre of government?
Yes.
And so we may be clear then, Mr. Reynolds, that was the position structurally within Number 10 and the Cabinet Office on the cusp of the pandemic, and when you all collectively first became aware of the problem emanating from China?
I'm not sure in terms of the timing of that. I think, as I say, there is a difference between the period before the crisis and the shift into crisis, where the situation gets dramatically worse. So some of the elements you may be talking about participation in meetings and so forth, may well be correct throughout the January-February period. But where the machine really struggles is when we shift into full crisis mode, where the fact we haven't got, as it were, plans means that and I can talk you through some of the responses, but the situation becomes extremely complicated and very high friction indeed, and that clearly makes a management of the crisis very difficult.
Are you essentially saying the machine was poor structurally, but it became even worse as the weeks passed?
I think the machine was not properly prepared for the scale of the crisis it was about to face. And that whereas the machine would have been prepared to deal with the sort of crises it had dealt with previously, and if you look at, I don't know, I'm from the Foreign Office, so if you look at an evacuation from Afghanistan or from Lebanon, or those sorts of, as it were, segmented crises which involve a relatively small number of government departments, the machine is equipped to deal with that, and I think it deals with it relatively efficiently, even if there are always bound to be ways to improve it. The difference in this case is, rather than a segmented crisis, which is covering 4 or 5 different government departments, you've got a whole of government crisis, which means every government department is dealing with a major departmental set of issues for which many of them were not properly prepared. That then feeds into a Cabinet Office set of structures which were not designed to manage a whole of government crisis in that nature. And that is what I think you're seeing in early March through to indeed the piece of work that Helen McNamara and I produced. I think it was in May.
It was. Milady, is that a convenient moment?
Certainly. I shall return at midday.
All right.
Keith.
On the 23rd of January, Mr. Reynolds, there was an email chain to which you were party, 136729, which concerned reports that I think 2 people have been admitted to hospital in Glasgow with suspected coronavirus. You'll see at the bottom of the page a media report, or at least a monitoring of media. 2 people have been admitted to the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital in Glasgow. And if we can scroll back out, we can see that you received an email saying, given this, I think we should go ahead and with the Cobra. Martin, that's you. Do you want to check with the PM or would you like me to do a quick note? You then replied saying, thanks, let me know, and I'll get back to CVS. Sorry, that's an email to you, not from you. Thanks, let me know, I'll get back to CVS. And then further on the page, you say he is content with it.
Fine.
So this is an example of you being informed of an important event in relation to the COVID crisis. On the 23rd of January, the Prime Minister didn't chair that Cobra. The Secretary of State at the Department of Health and Social Care, Matt Hancock MP, did. But it was the Prime Minister's view that there should be a Cobra.
Correct.
Can you recall why the Prime Minister himself didn't decide to chair the Cobra?
No, I cannot.
There is guidance for Cobra as to whether or not it should be the Prime Minister who chairs it or the Secretary of State for a lead government department or indeed an official. Is that not something that the Principal Private Secretary would debate with the Prime Minister?
Normally, I would rely on the advice of the Cabinet Secretary or the NSA on the person to be chairing an event. So normally the requester would come into me saying we recommend this. I would check with the political team whether they agreed or disagreed, and I'd put that advice to the Prime Minister.
But here the Prime Minister told you he thought there should be a Cobra.
Yes.
So presumably as part of that conversation, you would have discussed who should chair the Cobra.
Well, I might have just simply said to him, Prime Minister, there's a recommendation that Matt Hancock chairs a Cobra, given X, Y, Z has happened, and are you content with that? And I think, you know, the speed with which that information is relayed suggests to me it was that type of exchange.
If you discussed with the Prime Minister whether there should be a Cobra, to what extent did you seek to inform yourself about events on the world stage concerning the spread of the virus by that point, the 23rd of January?
I would have assumed and relied on the fact that Imran and others were tracking this very closely. In fact, in this case, I think, and I haven't got the document up anymore, but I believe the email seems to have come from the Foreign Affairs Assistant Private Secretary. And
it's been deleted.
Oh, is it?
That's sensitive and irrelevant. So, but in any event, that's the part of the government it came from. But, Mr. Reynolds, you understood that there was an incipient crisis concerning, or at least a risk that a viral pandemic would reach the United Kingdom. It required a Cobra to be instituted.
Yes.
You debated with the Prime Minister whether there should be one, and perhaps whether it should be him or somebody else who chaired it. Were you aware by that date, the 23rd of January, of the number of deaths outside China or the extent to which the virus had spread, and therefore to what extent Cobra should urgently be looking at this issue?
I'm sure I was aware of some elements of that. In terms of who actually chairs a meeting, I mean, I would certainly be involved in that consideration, but normally the recommendation would be coming in from the relevant part of Cabinet Office and potentially the Cabinet Secretary, as I say, and they would be giving a steer as to what they felt was appropriate at the time, given their assessment of what was going on. That I can disagree with that, and I can argue for something different, or I could argue against the Cobra entirely. But the people who are actually making the assessment there will will tend to be the Cabinet Office people dealing with the situation and who have a much better and more comprehensive assessment of what is happening than I do. I will talk to the political advisors and they may give a case for why it makes sense for the Prime Minister to chair the meeting. But in many cases, you can have quite a significant international or other crisis being chaired by a Cabinet Minister.
When you talked to them, did you ask them or did you debate to what extent this new novel virus was already a self-sustaining virus transmitted human to human? Did you ask? Did you know?
As I say, I think my picture of events at that stage would have been incomplete. The advice coming in would give a very clear sense of what was deemed sensible and appropriate in response to the situation at the time. And I can challenge that or I can second guess it if I have a very strong view. But in this situation, it looks from the email chain as I simply relayed the request and suggestion and checked it with the Prime Minister.
Did you take any steps yourself in advance of speaking to the Prime Minister to inform yourself about other aspects of the virus? Its fatality rate, how it was spreading, whether it would spread to the United Kingdom, what the consequences might be? Or did you just relay the administrative request for a COBRA?
I think that is a lot of within the government, there are people who are doing all of the things you are talking about, and they're producing advice into Downing Street as to what the appropriate response is. Now, I can second guess or contradict what's coming in, but actually, in this type of situation, if a request comes in of this nature from the private secretary who's tracking that issue, and probably, and again, I haven't seen the document, the other private secretary who's looking at the issue from a domestic preparedness perspective, if they are all broadly in agreement, I would normally check with the political team that they agreed in terms of the political salience and relay that request to the Prime Minister.
Mr. Reynolds, as the principal private secretary to the Prime Minister, did you not think it formed part of your functions to educate yourself on what the position was, what the risks that were emerging here were, and take part in this debate?
Well, I think I think, as I say, the nature of a private office is a flow of information between the machinery into the Prime Minister. And yes, on a range of issues, I can challenge and test and do all of that sort of thing. And it's certainly perfectly possible for me to have done so in this situation. But it's not self-evident to me that having the Health Secretary chair a COBRA on this issue was an inappropriate response to the challenge at that time. I don't know what other pressures there were. I don't know what other advice there was. But that, I think, is, from what I can see, that advice seems reasonable and proportionate.
I have not suggested that it was inappropriate for Mr. Hancock to chair the COBRA. My question was, why didn't you ask some basic questions about what this issue was concerning this emerging viral pandemic?
Well, from the email chain, it's impossible for me to confirm whether I did or didn't ask those questions.
Well, let's have 56226, please, which is minutes from a COBRA on the 29th of January. We can see the ministers who attended on the first page. It was chaired by the Right Hon. Matt Hancock, Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. The second page, please. My lady will see that a number of ministers from the devolved administrations dialed in. That goes to a question that you asked a few weeks ago. And then amongst the officials, we can see an unnamed or at least deleted official from number 10, but the permanent secretary from DHSC, the CMO, the GCSA, and so on and so forth. So a number of officials. And over the page, some officials dialed in, including the CMO for the Welsh Government and the CMO for Northern Ireland Executive. And then if we could go to page 5, please. The current situation update demonstrates that the chair invited the CMO and Public Health England to update the committee, COBRA, on the global situation. The GCSA gave a readout of a meeting of SAGE. And then at 3, the CMO said that UK planning assumptions were based on the reasonable worst-case scenario. There were 2 scenarios to be considered. The first was that the spread was confined within China. The second was that the spread was not limited to China and there would be a pandemic-like scenario. The second scenario was plausible, but it may take weeks to months. And then in 4, the reasonable worst-case scenario was said to be similar to that for pandemic influenza. There was a 10% likelihood of the reasonable worst-case scenario happening, but this figure had not been agreed by SAGE. Do you recall being given the product of this COBRA meeting, Mr. Reynolds? Do you recall yourself taking part in any debate thereafter about the import of this minute to the effect that there was a 10% likelihood of the reasonable worst-case scenario coming to pass?
No.
You were, though, responsible, were you not, for providing regular updates to the Prime Minister after this meeting. So I think from the 28th of January through to the 14th of February. Do you recall?
Well, I think the regular updates would have been provided by either the Foreign Affairs Assistant Private Secretary or Imran Shafi.
All right. Well, let's have a very quick look at how the Prime Minister was informed about the outcome of this meeting. INQ 136734 is an email from the Private Office Support Team copying to you and to a number of other officials, but including the Prime Minister, referring to a box return. What is a box return?
It's the amendment the Prime Minister will make to the document. So my guess would be that the duty clerks or PM Post, which is essentially the same thing, will have cut and pasted the note from PM onwards and put it on a card. And attached here, I can't see what is attached, but my guess would be that
a note.
There'll be a note back with the Prime Minister's manuscript comments on it, or just simply acknowledging it.
Right, 136737, please. PM, a brief update on coronavirus and evacuations of British nationals. The note appears, and it's dated the 30th of January, it appears to be concerned exclusively with the repatriation of United Kingdom nationals from the Hubei province, or at least China, correct?
Yes.
So, as you recall it, at the end of January, what the government was focusing on, certainly insofar as the Prime Minister was concerned, was the position in China and the repatriation of UK nationals.
Yes, although, if I may, I mean, the person who's produced this note is the Foreign Affairs Private Secretary. So we also have a Private Secretary, Imran Shafi, who is, I believe at this stage, so as it were, working in tandem with the Foreign Affairs Private Secretary to make sure that we're tracking the domestic implications. And that's why I assume this note is focused on the international dimension. But you're right that this is, at that stage, we are focused on the international dimension.
136732. There is a readout from, I think, a meeting from the Prime Minister in which he expresses his view that, or rather he's advised that he should spend more time with his ministers discussing these issues. If you could scroll in on the top half of the page, please. There's an email from you on the 31st of January at 11:25. Mark, many thanks for this. I understand that Matt Hancock is keen to proceed with this, but we will cover coronavirus at the start of the meeting. It also helps deliver on the PM's strong desire to be spending more time discussing the issues with his ministers. So you debated with the Prime Minister, presumably, what was happening, the fact that there were COBRAs being instituted and that there was a incipient crisis coming.
Either I would have been doing so, as I say, or one of the private secretaries who may well have been talking to the private Prime Minister at this period. But here I think the question was whether whether we want to proceed with a meeting on health, which I think we agreed to do so.
In your evidence earlier, Mr. Reynolds, you gave, if I may say so, a distinct impression that you processed papers, you made sure the system was working to provide the Prime Minister with material, with information, and so on. This email from you would appear to indicate that you spoke to the key players about what was happening, that the issues which were arising were debated with you.
I didn't say I was, no, I think what I'm trying to say was I'm not someone who is giving, as it were, strong advice on how to respond to the COVID pandemic. I'm present in meetings and I'm aware, as we can see from this text, that the Prime Minister is keen to spend more time discussing this issue with his ministers. Now, how he expressed that to me, whether that was in a small group or in a meeting or whatever, I cannot recall.
136733, please, is an update from the Civil Contingency Secretariat dated the 3rd of February. We're aware, of course, of what the CCS is, the Civil Contingency Secretariat, but it provides an update on the outbreak of novel coronavirus. If we can just scroll through 1 and 2. It's largely concerned with British nationals in China, repatriation and communications. And then at the bottom of that page, second page, cross-government meetings. There was a SAGE meeting held on the 3rd of February. It focused on future travel advice. There was a reference then to a cross-government meeting to discuss plans for a possible ministerial tabletop exercise. And then the CCS would chair a cross-government meeting to test preparedness on excess death policy and plans, and there'd be another COBRA. To what extent were you cited on the decisions to have a ministerial tabletop exercise, a cross-government meeting, and so on?
I doubt I was involved. I mean, I think a lot of this looks like the normal crisis response being coordinated at the Cabinet Office level with all sorts of activities taking place. I am copied in, and so I assume I'm copied in, although I haven't got the list. But the officials which will be tracking this most closely will be the Foreign Affairs Private Secretary and Imran Shafi. And that, I suppose, what I'm trying to say is during this initial phase, the machinery is running things and the Private Secretary is moving back and forth, relaying information up and transmitting sort of guidance down. That is sort of what's happening here. And I think, so it's possible that they had views on some of these elements, but I certainly would not have been involved, I don't think.
At 136740, there is an email dated the 8th of February containing an update for the Prime Minister from, indeed, Imran Shafi, so dealing with the health part, if you like, of the private secretary system. A further update on developments regarding coronavirus. There's a reference to the Princess Diamond cruise ship. On the domestic side, emergency regulations will be laid. If we could scroll back out, we'll see that you were one of the persons copied into the email from Imran Shafi, because it goes to Edward Lister, Dominic Cummings, yourself, Stuart Glasborough, and another unnamed person in number 10. Did you take any view as to whether or not within this part of the private secretary system, the health part of it, sufficient attention was being paid to not just the repatriation of individuals and to the Princess Diamond cruise ship, but on the risks of the virus coming to the United Kingdom?
Well, if I can just start on the process, every piece of paper which goes into the Prime Minister will be copied to the copy. So I will see absolutely everything. And to some extent, my confidence on reflecting on whether I need to be doing any further action will depend on my confidence on the private secretaries. And I was confident that if they felt there was a problem, they would have told me, and if they felt the machinery wasn't delivering. But I don't recall whether I had conversations with Imran or indeed the Foreign Affairs Private Secretary at this stage about whether we were sufficiently prepared.
forgive me, what was the point of emailing you in, copying you in to this abundance of correspondence if your position was, it's not my bag, this isn't part of my responsibility, I'm not going to engage in it?
No, I think what you've got is a funnel of work coming through. So it's almost how the private secretaries work. There is a massive amount of information going to the Prime Minister on a whole range of sensitive issues. And each private secretary is running, as it were, the issues they're leading on. They're very experienced in it, and particularly, if you've got one of the senior private secretaries like Imran leading on it, that private secretary will be the person who is managing the private secretarial role on that issue. I have, as it were, got an overview of everything everybody's doing, as has Stuart, and yes, we can pick up things if we feel that balls are being dropped, but actually it's more that this is a sort of information flow in between the system and the Prime Minister. And as I say, in a sort of standard crisis situation, the private secretaries sit on top of a machine which is doing all the analysis and doing all the assessments of what needs to be done, and it is essentially ensuring there's a regular updates to the Prime Minister and regular information from the Prime Minister down again.
Mr. Reynolds, what could have been more important in terms of the obligation on you to pick things up than being informed of the early part of a fatal viral epidemic?
Well, I think in a sense it probably misunderstands the nature of my role. The nature of my role is to manage the organisation of the operation around the Prime Minister and to ensure he's getting a good service from the private secretaries in terms of being updated on what is going on, being asked for decisions, being consulted on things. It's all that side of things, and you're right that I could, and clearly with the benefit of hindsight, should have focused a lot more of my energy on just tracking coronavirus. But that really isn't the nature of, it isn't the fundamental nature of the private office role, which is trying to manage, as it were, an operation and sitting on top of another operation, which is doing far more detailed analysis of the scale of the problems we're facing, the state of our preparedness and things like that.
May we take it from that, therefore, that although there were scientific papers being prepared around this time and put before SAGE and another committee called SPI-MO, to the effect that the overall case fatality rate was 1% and that the feasibility of controlling the virus was very low indeed, that sort of information didn't come your way?
I wouldn't have been, I don't recall proactively seeking out papers on this to read. I would have relied on briefings from Imran or maybe Stuart or the assistant private secretary and relied on them to be tracking things. But even that information, the people who should really be processing that were the health experts and the people in Cabinet Office. The private secretaries are not running the COVID crisis response, although, as I say, when we come back to the crisis period, I'll say their role slightly changes.
The matter was debated in Cabinet on the 14th of February, and there was a debate about whether or not the United Kingdom should plan for the reasonable worst-case scenario. Mm-hmm. Did you know that?
I would probably have been in Cabinet.
Right. Then, around about the 24th of February, in an email chain to which I think you may have been party, Mr. Shafi says, I'd like to start exposing the Prime Minister to the potential decisions he might have to make. So this comes back to your evidence, the effect that Mr. Shafi would be responsible primarily for guiding the Prime Minister as to what might need to be done and for informing him. Could we have 146563? You were copied in on this. There's an email from, at the top of the page, the Director of the Civil Contingencies Secretariat, just to add, we're working at the moment on a whole sequence of decisions that would be needed in the event we concluded a pandemic was the most likely scenario, which would also be useful in exposing some of these concrete points. And then towards the bottom of the page, we can see the email from Mr. Shafi saying, I'd like to start exposing the PM to the potential decisions. When you read this email, Mr. Reynolds, did you ask yourself, why do we need to wait to see whether a pandemic is the most likely scenario before we start taking practical steps to control the spread of the virus?
I can't recall whether I did. I think what I will have done was taken two things from this. One is that across government, the relevant people in the form of Catherine Hammond, but also copied into the email chain, seem to be Chris Whitty, the government chief scientific advisor Patrick Vallance, and various others. I would have taken reassurance from the fact that the work is underway across government to prepare for what could be a reasonable worst case scenario. And Imran is asking me if they can brief the Prime Minister on this, and I seem to recollect we briefed the Prime Minister the following day. So I'm taking it as a serious issue which needed the attention of the Prime Minister, but I'm not second-guessing the preparedness or the concerns or the understanding, as it were, of the experts leading on this issue, notably Catherine Hammond and the core scientific health people.
The material shows that there were no box notes to the Prime Minister sent to him between the 14th of February and the 24th, at least in relation to coronavirus. There were no COBRAs dealing at least with coronavirus during that time. There was no cabinet, and we're unable to see much by way of emails to the Prime Minister during that 10-day period. As the principal private secretary, can you venture a suggestion as to why that might have been?
Well, I think decisions on COBRAs would have been, as I say, it would have been a question for the people working on COBRAs in Cabinet Office to make a decision and make a recommendation.
I'm very sorry to interrupt, Mr. Reynolds. The question was very clear. There were no communications by email, by COBRA, by box notes with the Prime Minister during that 10-day period on coronavirus. Why do you think that might have been?
Sorry, can I clarify the COBRA communication? I don't understand.
Well, there was no COBRA meeting and therefore nothing to put to the Prime Minister as a result of a COBRA meeting.
Fine.
There were no emails. There were no notes put in his red box. You don't appear to have been in touch with him about coronavirus or anybody else.
I cannot recall why and whether there was any urgent business to transact over that period with the Prime Minister.
Was it half term, Mr. Reynolds?
I'm happy to accept it was half term if that is you will know more than me.
Mr. Reynolds, do you or do you not know that February half term fell around that period in February of 2020? Did you know that?
I didn't when you asked me, but it makes sense when you now clarify it in that way.
To what extent, as the Principal Private Secretary, did you ask yourself, we've got COBRA meetings, we've got cabinet meetings, we've got emails about a viral pandemic coming our way. Why is nothing being done in terms of keeping the Prime Minister in the loop for those 10 days?
And I probably should have done so. Equally, I think there are many others who would normally have said we need to just keep the Prime Minister updated. Can we update him with X, Y, or Z?
Before the end of half term, SPI-MO had confirmed sustained transmission. SAGE had noted that Public Health England could only cope with 5 coronavirus cases per week. And of course, the United Kingdom became aware of lockdowns in 10 municipalities in Italy. When you heard of the fact that a lockdown had begun in Italy, what was your reaction?
I think we were very concerned, and I seem to recall that Imran Shafi was asked Catherine Hammond as to how we would respond in a similar situation in the UK.
Did you say, we have a major problem here, we've got to get in touch with the Prime Minister, we must raise the issue of whether or not there are urgent steps we are required to take straight away?
No.
On the 25th of February, following half-term, there was a meeting between the Prime Minister, the Health Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, the CMO, the CSA and others, where the issue of borders, amongst other issues, were discussed. 136745. At the bottom of the page, domestic preparedness. The Civil Contingency Secretariat was asked to provide a 4 to 5 page note for the Prime Minister, signed off by a number of people, including the Civil Contingency Secretariat, that highlights the most significant choices should a pandemic occur in the United Kingdom. Could we please have this put to the Prime Minister by 11 a.m. on Friday so that he could read over the weekend? So a few days hence, 3 or 4 days hence. You were copied in on this email correspondence. We can see your name at the top of the page. Did you address with anybody the issue of whether or not these steps concerned with communications, repatriation, international task force, and asking the CCS for a paper would be enough?
No, but I mean, the actions seem to have come out of a meeting with the Health Secretary, the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Scientific Advisor, and others. And I would have thought they would have been better placed than me to make that judgment.
On the 27th, the Prime Minister stated that he was keen to step up activity on COVID. Could we have, please, 136747? An email went to Stuart Glasborough, yourself, and the private office support team for the Prime Minister called Post. At the bottom of the page, we can see an email. It's addressed, in fact, to the PM. If you could go over the page. It came after an earlier email, again, copied to you. Thanks, Stuart, will do. Imran, let's discuss. And an email at the bottom of the page from Stuart Glasborough. In the margins of another meeting, the PM just said he's keen to really step up activity on coronavirus, both in the sense of what we're doing and how that's presented. More frequent COBRAs, that sort of thing, PM leading them. It was developing into a national crisis, was it not, Mr. Reynolds? Was that an issue, or were these issues which by the 27th of February you were discussing with the Prime Minister?
Well, I think I assume those discussions would have been happening. I mean, Stuart is my deputy, and so what he's saying will have been, important and directive for people. So what he seems to be saying here is very sensible.
As is PPS, why had you not already asked him to step up activity on coronavirus?
Well, I think that he had a range of other advisors who would have been saying, again, it's, as I say, it sort of seems a slightly, it's a mischaracterization of my role, that I'm there to, as it were, second guess the advice of the medical, health, crisis and other advisors going to him. And it seems to me that what we see from has been happening is he is getting good advice on that. And so I'm pretty reassured by the fact that Stuart is talking it through with him. And indeed that in the previous slide you had the key advisors talking to the Prime Minister and walking him through the challenges he might face.
Well, no, they asked for a paper to be provided 3 days hence as to what options he might face.
And that is walking him through the options he's got.
No, the paper hadn't yet been prepared, Mr. Reynolds, had it?
Fine, okay. But I suppose my point is he's speaking to the people who are the experts in how to handle a pandemic and the state of the pandemic at that stage, and they're producing further advice, and that is getting to him very quickly, and he is responding to Stuart or Imran or others as to how he wants to handle it. So he's aware of the growing situation too. So it feels to me as if actually there isn't that much of a disconnect between what the senior COVID advisors are saying and what the Prime Minister is believing.
And what was his reaction at this stage, the beginning of March, to what he was being told?
I think you would have to ask Imran or Stuart as the reaction to that. I can't. Beyond what I've got in front of me, I cannot recall.
This is fast developing into the largest crisis the United Kingdom has faced, possibly since the Second World War. Did you discuss with him what his general view was on what should be done, or how we should respond?
I think he was having, well, I mean, as we saw previously, he's having meetings with ministers, senior advisors on this, and those are, I'm sure, the content of the discussions going on.
Did he think it was a big deal?
Yes, I mean, well, from the papers I can recall, at every time he's asked to deal with something, he deals with it very quickly, and at various points he's saying, I'm always happy to do more. So the impression I get is he is reassured by the fact that the machine is actually working on these issues, and he's offering to do more. But equally, the Prime Minister doesn't always have to do everything personally and can delegate to ministers, can delegate to machinery, and if there is a sense that everything is under control.
Did he think or express a view to you along the lines that this pandemic, if it turned into a pandemic, wasn't a big deal, it might be like swine flu, and that his greatest concern was talking the economy into a slump?
I can't remember words to that effect, but I do believe he was concerned that if we reacted in certain ways, we could actually generate a sense of panic and concern, which would be counterproductive.
You don't appear to have been engaged, or rather you were engaged less than you had been hitherto between the 2nd and the 10th of March. There's very little by way of emails to and from your email account. By the 10th of March and the 11th of March, so the week ending in Friday the 13th of March, do you recall whether or not your understanding of the pandemic, its sustained transmission in the United Kingdom, the now evident lack of control, and the number of deaths which had started being brought to your attention?
I think that was the week when there were real problems emerging in Lombardy, and we're all realising that the nature of the pandemic is far more significant than we had anticipated. And I think it was at the end of that week that there was a session in the Prime Minister's office without the Prime Minister, with Dominic Cummings and Helen McNamara, trying to revisit. I mean, I believe that's the timing, but if that is the case.
That is.
So I think, in a sense, everyone is starting to see what's happening in Italy, northern Italy from memory, and everyone knows that the health system in northern Italy is actually very sophisticated and good, and we are seeing it failing to respond to the crisis in a way which is very striking. And so I think that is certainly part of the reason that she's seeing what is happening. I believe also, and I don't think I was directly involved myself, some of those looking at the modelling and some of the thinking behind this are starting to realise that that may not be quite as robust as we'd anticipated. And I think people are also starting to think through whether our plans were in an appropriate place. So I agree it's happening quite late, but that is what's happening, I believe, that week. My role in that, I cannot recall.
Since you've expressed a view on the possible lateness, do you accept that there was indeed an untoward delay of weeks between the middle of February and Friday the 13th of March, during which time the virus has, of course, reached the United Kingdom, has spread, is out of control, and relatively speaking, little has been done?
I agree. I think the problem, I mean, or at least the thing which we didn't do and should have done had we had as it were more notice, was to actually properly test our plans. So the challenge from my perspective would be that for a period of a month we have been assuming a certain number of things, including that the plans are in place. Whereas if you'd had a month to prepare, I think it would have been possible to deal with some of the issues which we then confronted in a slightly more orderly way.
Plans for what?
Plans for dealing with the crisis. I mean, I think...
What do you mean? Committee structures, working... What do you mean?
I think both. I mean, I think that it comes back to my sort of explanation of how a crisis works, is you need the departments to be ready to deal with the issues they're confronting. And so, for example, if, again, speaking about the department I know best, the Foreign Office knows how to deal with an evacuation. And so in COVID, actually, its job is relatively straightforward. It's very large scale and complicated, but it has a playbook for dealing with what it's going to have to deal with. And I think some of the other government departments are properly prepared for what they're going to have to deal with and perform pretty well. And the obvious ones, I would guess, would be the Treasury and DWP. But if you look round, as it were, all the government departments, my impression, and I have to say it's only an impression, is that they were not crisis ready. And that meant crisis ready in two things. One is they didn't have a playbook. And the second is they hadn't really thought through how they're going to deliver that playbook. And I would view, I mean, when we talk about plans, I think a pandemic as complex and challenging as COVID, you can't have a sort of meticulously organised plan, but you need to know, it seems to me, the parameters of what you're trying to achieve and what your strategic direction is. And I think the fact that my impression, again, it's a very impressionistic thing from the centre, that none of that was really, well, not all of that was in place, meant that you're playing catch up in a large number of different areas. And then if you look into the centre, and how the centre performs. If you look at how a centre normally operates in a crisis, it's essentially there to give strategic direction and to broker compromises between departments. The problem when you haven't got plans at the outer ring is that you are then expecting the centre to come up with strategic direction and broker all these different things at the same time. And so you've got far too much being overloaded into the centre when actually in an ideal world, some of those decisions and preparations would already been in place and you'd be able to take some of that stress off the system.
But you were suggesting, I thought, that the centre wasn't prepared either.
No, and I think that's the flip side, is in a sense, what happens in a normal crisis is you have a coordinating function between, let's say, 4 or 5 departments. So if you talk about an evacuation, you would have 4 or 5 departments going into crisis. So they've got crisis centres about as big as this room, with 80 to 100 people in there. They're working through the practical arrangements for dealing with that crisis. And you'll have that in 4 or 5 different departments. And you'll have the Cabinet Office, as it were, acting as the department which brings it all together in the overall strategy, but also is sorting out differences between departments, which are almost inevitable in any crisis. So, I don't know, for an example, deployment of a military asset in support of an evacuation might be something you'd need to discuss at a Cabinet Office level. And you've got your structures in place for, as it were, a normal crisis. The problem here is, if you view it as a segment of a circle, that's one segment, and that can be quite a big crisis. And even in a big crisis, the pressure into number 10 is quite limited, so you'd have 2 or 3 private secretaries probably working it. What you've got with COVID is you've got a full circle of crisis. Every single department is basically in a crisis, and therefore coordinating that at the centre is immensely challenging. And what happens, my sort of assessment of that, is quite logically at the time, the team involved say, well, okay, this is 4 times as big as a normal crisis. We'll have 4 ministerial groups who will look at different segments of the circle, as it were. And that has a sort of logic and coherence to it. But the problem with having 4 separate committees is they almost certainly involve the same people for every government department, so you're quadrupling the amount of coordination going on. And the interdependencies are very hard to manage, so you can't operate, as it were, as one single committee. You have to say, well, we can do this, but we'd like to hear what X committee thinks over there. And so you haven't got the coordinating function which you need for a crisis of this scale. And so I think those two mean that you have a mixed performance at the departmental level. Cabinet Office machine starts to gum up very seriously. And if you're happy, I can continue and continue to explain.
That's right, I think it's quite a long answer,
yeah,
really.
Sorry.
I think Mr. Keith will get you back on the track.
Mr. Reynolds.
Yeah, sorry.
Please may we put aside the administrative administrative explanation of how systems of government work. The reality at the beginning of March, after 4 or 5 weeks of warnings, was it became apparent that there was no plan in the form of the NHS or the DHSC for dealing with a coronavirus pandemic. Yes or no?
I'm not sure I can. I think the plan wasn't sophisticated enough to deal with the crisis it was facing. I don't think I can answer whether there was no plan, because
There was no plan for coronavirus, was there, Mr. Reynolds? You know there wasn't. You know that as a matter of strategy, there had never been any debate about a coronavirus. The United Kingdom strategy was based expressly upon a pandemic influenza. Do you agree there was no plan for coronavirus?
I'm not sufficiently expert
All right.
to say whether the plans which were pre-existing were replicable for the nature of the crisis we're doing and to what extent.
In number 10, there was an appreciation at the beginning of March that there were no plans to bring together the activities of the other government departments. Yes or no?
Well, we had the existing structures and they were inadequate for what we were doing.
Did you have plans to deal with the crisis which had broken upon the United Kingdom government in the first week in March?
I mean, as I say, there is a standard set of protocols which are actually Cabinet Office protocols for dealing with crisis. Where I agree with you is they were inadequate to deal with the crisis we were confronted with.
And the Cabinet Office failed in its prime obligation of coordinating the position, including other government departments, to ensure that there were plans and a proper strategy in place. Correct.
Correct.
And number 10, failed to get on top of the Cabinet Office and to ensure that there were plans before that time. Correct.
Actually, I mean, on the email traffic I saw, Dominic Cummings, to his credit, was asking to see the plans about a week or 10 days previously.
And what was the answer, Mr. Reynolds?
I don't know. I'd have to ask Imran.
You know that he asked repeatedly for plans and there were none, as far as he could tell. You're nodding.
Well,
Is that a yes?
I'm acknowledging that's what you're saying. As I say, I think you need to check with both Dominic Cummings and Imran and others.
And what did you make of the plans for quarantining, for shielding, for scaled-up test and trace, and potentially lockdown that you looked at in the course of these days in early March in number 10?
I wasn't reviewing the plans, but what I would say is it was very clear once the crisis started that the plans were inadequate to the extent they existed. And so what essentially is happening in that period of the early crisis is everyone is having to operate without a proper playbook.
The playbook, do you mean a plan by playbook?
Yes, I think there is a difference between a playbook and a plan in the sense that a playbook gives you the framework to operate, and I suppose maybe it's a point for me rather, maybe it's a to. But I think, given the nature of COVID, it seems to me to have a fully worked up plan across every single eventuality is unlikely to be as successful as targeting the key areas and making sure you have really clear plans in place in those specific areas.
But regardless of whether it's a playbook or a rule book or a plan or anything, whatever there was, Mr. Reynolds, was grossly deficient.
I agree.
Right.
I agree.
And then on Friday the 13th of March, Helen McNamara, Dominic Cummings, Ben Warner and some others who were increasingly concerned about what the data was showing. Putting aside modelling, the infection fatality rate, which had been known for weeks, the hospitalisation rate, which had been known for weeks, indicated that the NHS would be overwhelmed, correct? Mm-hmm. You attended that meeting with Mr. Cummings and Mr. Warner and Miss McNamara, did you not?
At least in part, I believe.
Do you recall the outcome of that meeting?
Well, the outcome, I think, was a series of meetings the following day with the Prime Minister and others.
Did you say to your colleagues, how could we possibly have dropped the ball in this way? How could we possibly not have seen that with an infection fatality rate of 1% and no means of controlling the virus, overwhelming of the NHS was inevitable?
I think everyone would have felt that at that time. I mean, that evening, when the scale of the issues confronting us looked enormous, I think everyone would have been thinking, how did we get to this position?
But you'd known for days, if not weeks, how many beds there are in the NHS. Had you not?
Again, I think I would look back at, you have very serious and senior experts in the NHS, in the Cabinet Office, and all of those things, all of those different parts of government, and the points you're making are equally valid to them. I mean, I agree that I could have identified the issues myself, but fundamentally, the fact we got into that position is the result of a systemic failure and a failure of the people who are really tracking the situation most closely.
Are you suggesting that it was other people's fault?
No, I'm suggesting that there are other people it was actually the focus of their efforts and energies, and my job as the principal private secretary was to make sure that the overall operation of Downing Street was supporting the Prime Minister and ensure he got the right balance of advice. And during this period, he is getting support from a range of private secretaries linking into the machine, but also having regular contact with the experts. And on the following day, he's got Helen McNamara and others walking him through the issues as identified.
There was a general understanding that much more stringent measures were required. And of course, more stringent measures were put in place at the beginning of the following week, correct?
Yes.
Mr. Cummings and others say that during the course of that week, however, the Prime Minister oscillated between going further and pursuing a lockdown, which had by that stage already come up for debate, or relying upon the less stringent measures which had already been put into place. Were you aware of that oscillation?
I imagine so, yes.
Well, you couldn't have forgotten,
Yes.
Mr. Reynolds.
That's what I'm saying, yes.
Right, so you do remember.
Yes.
And when the Prime Minister said to you, one day, I'm going to go for the lockdown because of the crisis on the NHS, and then the next day he backed and veered and said, I'm not sure about this. What did you say?
I'm not advising him on how to respond to the COVID pandemic. He has got advice from a whole range of other leading experts on how to manage, and he's confronting a very, very difficult decision. I don't think it's my job to tell him what the answer is in a given situation. My job is to make sure he gets the right advice, and so he can reach the appropriate decision.
But unless you tell him what that advice is, where it's coming from, what its cogency is, whether it's good advice, how can he rely upon his principal private secretary to guide him through this nightmare scenario?
I'm not, with the greatest of respect, I'm not sure I'm the person who's guiding him through.
All right.
I'm making sure he is working with the key advisors, be it Chris Whitty or Patrick Vallance or whoever it might be, that the flow of information is appropriate and he's getting the necessary support he needs from Imran or from Stuart Glassborough or whoever else. But in this period, I'm not his primary advisor on COVID.
Did you know what he was doing day to day?
Yes.
Could we have 226185, please? Page 68. This is an extract from the Prime Minister's diary. On the Wednesday evening, so at the height of the 10-day crisis between the change in strategy on Friday the 13th of March and the imposition of lockdown on the Monday the 23rd, in 1942 he had a phone call with Evgeny Lebedev, and on the following page, page 69 please, he took further time to meet with him. Although I now can't see. Yes,
yeah, it is
1756, private meeting with Evgeny Lebedev and Ben Gascoigne and Lee Cain. Was that to do with COVID, Mr. Reynolds? Do you know?
I don't.
Do you know what it was about?
I don't. I wasn't present in it. There was no civil servant present, so.
Do you have access to the Prime Minister's diary?
Yes.
Did you know he was seeing Mr. Lebedev?
I would have done, yes.
Did you ask him what he was seeing him about?
I wouldn't normally, if it was a non-civil service meeting, I wouldn't normally ask him for the content of his discussions. And so in that meeting, he's been accompanied both by the Director of Comms and the Political Secretary, both of them are political.
At the height of the crisis, he goes for a private meeting with, I think, Lord Lebedev. Did you not ask him, why are you spending time on this, Prime Minister? We've got rather more urgent matters to deal with.
I cannot recall whether I did or didn't, but ultimately, I mean, it's for the Prime Minister to decide his use of time, and if he decided that was important, it's for him to decide. I may have said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" But or indeed others may have done the same.
The lockdown was, of course, imposed shortly after. On the 27th of March, the Prime Minister contracted COVID. Your witness statement makes plain that a number of people became infected in Downing Street. Mm-hmm. The physical layout, the rabbit warren nature of the building, no doubt contributed to that. What impact did the illness of the Prime Minister and a number of other senior officials have on the ability of the government to respond to the crisis?
I think operationally, and actually I would also add, that a number of senior officials in Cabinet Office were also ill. And I think the rotation of staff through, as it were, through different teams over this period made it complicated. I mean, I think that and the shift to remote working meant that managing the crisis was far harder than it would have been otherwise. In terms of the Prime Minister's illness, my recollection is he was ill after the lockdown had been announced and after a lot of the key decisions had been taken. So I don't think it had such a dramatic impact, although I guess it is possible to suggest that had he not been ill, we would have started moving forward with some of the activities around reorganisation and so forth slightly sooner. But it's very hard to predict. And actually, the period with Dominic Raab, as it were, deputising for him, it seemed to me we worked pretty effectively and got a lot of stuff done.
You say in your statement that Mr. Raab had a different working style from the Prime Minister. What did you mean by that?
The nature of a private office is you need to...
Could you please answer the question? What were the differences in working style of the Prime Minister and Dominic Raab?
Well, Dominic Raab liked a very structured private office operation with very clear preparations on meeting agendas, very structured existence, everything delivered to him very, very early in the morning, I think 6 o'clock in the morning, and it was a very different operation to what I suppose I would describe as a slightly more fluid arrangement with the Prime Minister.
What is a slightly more fluid arrangement?
Well, with the Prime Minister, it was possible to adapt much more easily to changes during the day. So if you had information coming in and you needed to change the diary or amend, you needed someone to go into his office for 5 minutes to talk him through something, he was much more amenable to that type of flexibility than Dominic Raab, who wanted a much more structured existence where he knew from the outset of the day exactly what meetings he was going into, what papers he needed to read, and all of that. And both approaches have their benefits and challenges in a crisis where things are moving quite quickly.
Were they the same in terms of their consistency to approach to decision making decisions and sticking to them?
I think they're very different people, and I think that I was working for Dominic Raab essentially for 3 weeks, so it's hard to compare and contrast.
There is a great deal of material from WhatsApps, Mr. Cummings' statement, Patrick Vallance's diaries, WhatsApps, showing that following his return from his illness, the Prime Minister again oscillated in terms of what should be done. He wondered whether he should be regarded as the mayor in the Jaws film, shutting the beaches, and then within hours or days, he would take a contrary position. And this was noted by Mr. Cummings, Mr. Case, Sir Patrick Vallance, and others. Did you notice that?
I think it's fair to say that the Prime Minister did, as it were, blow hot and cold on some issues.
On the most vital issues which his government faced?
Yes, but also the most difficult choices the country was facing, both of which had very difficult consequences.
My lady, is that a convenient moment?
It is. How much longer do you think?
We're not there yet, but not a lot longer is, I'm afraid to say, the most I can say at this moment.
I'm sorry we have to ask you to come back this afternoon, Mr. Reynolds. I shall return at 2:00.
All rise.